Hi, 4th, 6th, and 7th period. Chapter 54 is called Ashes. And the last time we read, Molly was trying to burn down the tree by putting stuff in the knothole, but it wasn't working. So she saw a banknote get sucked in from when figs and stubs were in there, and she realized that it was accepting its own gifts back. So she just took the letters from her mom and dad out of her pocket, and that's where we stopped. Smoke billowed in from the hall, stinging Molly's eyes. She pulled the stack of worn letters from her pocket and stared at the words written across the top envelope. Molly. She held the letters close, tears spilling down her cheeks. The walls around her were consumed with flames. Molly touched the letters to the fire, and they caught almost at once. The paper crackled and curled as the flames spread. She raised the burning envelopes in her trembling hands and walked toward the tree. Goodbye, she said, and dropped them into the knothole. The letters disappeared into the black abyss, falling, falling, falling. Molly heard a crackling noise as the fire took hold somewhere deep inside the tree. The sound grew louder. Orange light flickered in the hollow darkness, growing brighter and brighter until hot flames burst from the knothole, consuming the tree. She heard a wheezing breath in her ear and turned around to see the night gardener in the hall. His pale skin was charred and cracked. His hat was gone, and from his tattered clothes wafted a thin trail of black smoke. He hissed at Molly, his lips pulled back in a hateful rictus. She was trapped inside the room, flames on every side. She inched back from the man. The night gardener lunged at her. Snap! He howled as his foot broke off from his leg. He clung to the doorway, still staring at her, his eyes two smoldering embers of rage. Smoke now billowed out from his clothes, his mouth, his every pore. He pulled himself upright and took another step. Snap! He fell as his other leg broke off at the knee, turning to ash. He hissed, dragging his body toward her. He reached out a trembling hand. Snap! His fingers crumbled into the fine dust, peppering the floor. With a final wheezing sound, the gardener collapsed into a pile of ash. Molly clutched her hands to her racing heart, staring at the remains of the night gardener. They had fought the monster, and they had won. It took Molly a moment to realize that the house was coming down around her. She leaped back as part of the ceiling fell through in a shower of sparks. She coughed, covering her face, and ran to the shattered window. She hoisted herself up in the frame and clambered onto the roof. Outside, the flames were even wilder. They roared like an ocean in her ears. She looked out over the eaves. The ground below seemed to twist and waffle in the blistering heat. Somewhere in the distance, she thought she could hear Bertrand shouting her name, and more distant still, she thought she could hear her parents. Through the quivering heat, she saw Master Windsor dragging his wife's mattress across the lawn, feathers trailing behind him. He brought it to just below the house, just below Molly's feet. She took aim and jumped. Molly hit the mattress with a hard crash. She rolled onto the grass, clutching her ankle, which felt sprained. A faint voice sounded in her ear. She opened her eyes to see Bertrand kneeling over her. He took her by the shoulders and pulled her upright. Master Windsor dragged her across the lawn, shouting something that sounded like the house, the house. Suddenly she heard a tremendous ripping sound. She looked back to see the tree and house collapsing in a giant explosion of flames. Molly stared at the mountain of fire, tears filling her eyes. It's over, she said, her voice hoarse. Master Windsor held her shoulders. It's over. They held each other, hugging with everything in them. Already the flames had begun to die down, the roar replaced by a low, crackling murmur. It was above this sound that Molly heard a new voice. Papa! Molly! Hurry! Molly looked toward the road. Penny was running toward them, waving her arms. Molly clung to Master Windsor, both rushing to meet the girl. What is it? Bertrand said. It's your brother. Penny stepped to one side, and beyond her Molly saw a heavy figure moving toward them. Alistair, his face and clothes dripping wet, and clutched in his arms with Kip. Kip! Molly let go of Master Windsor and stumbled toward them. Alistair fell to his knees and laid Kip's body on the ground. "I'm sorry," he said, gasping. "He jumped in the river. He saved us." Molly stared at her brother, who was limp and unmoving. His mouth was open, but Molly could hear no breath. A cry crept up through her chest and came out as a whimper. "No," she said. "No, no, 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 no. Not Kip. Not him." She took his dripping body, pulling him to her chest. "You cannot do this," she whispered, a desperate, tuneless keen. "You cannot die. Not you. Not you." Molly could sense people standing around her, but she could not see them. She did not care. All she cared about was Kip. She buried her face in his wet hair and closed her eyes. She tried to find words, something she could say, something to bring him back, and in the darkness the words came to her. There once was... Molly swallowed, and she spoke the words aloud. "There once was a little boy named Kip." She swallowed again, forcing back tears. "He was a very special little boy, like none other. He had red hair like his father, and green eyes like his mother, and a frightened spirit like the devil himself. But most of all, he had a sister who loved him more than anything in the whole world." She pressed her lips together. "But one day, that sister made a mistake, and she didn't care for him like he needed, like he deserved, and she didn't tell him the truth." She closed her eyes, unable to go on. "I'm sorry," she whispered into his ear, and then released him. "I'm sorry." Kip lay motionless, his face lit bright against the flames. His body shuddered. He coughed, his head lurching forward, gulping for air. Water spewed from his mouth, spilling over his chin and neck. Molly leapt back, startled. "Kip!" She hunched over him, afraid to touch him, afraid that what she was seeing might not be real. Kip gasped, shivering, blinking into the firelight. He swallowed, catching his breath. "What?" His eyes met Molly's, and a faint smile crept across his lips. "What happened next?" Chapter 55 is what happened next. The flames died down just before dawn. Where the house and tree had once stood, there was now only a mountain of black ashes that smoldered gently in the dewy light of early morning. Already the life of the valley had begun to encroach upon the long decaying island, and all around her Molly could hear birds and insects chirping and buzzing. The fire had been bright enough to attract attention from the village, and with the morning light came a few brave locals who marveled at what they saw. Even without knowing the truth about the tree, it was plain to anyone who set foot in the place that the sour woods were cursed no more. Word spread quickly within Cellar Hollow, and soon men and women were appearing on the long neglected road to see the burned remains, perhaps also to leave baskets of food and blankets and clothes for the Windsors. The gifts were welcome, for the great fire had consumed every last piece of the Windsors' former lives, everything, that is, but their lives, and for that they were all of them grateful. Molly walked along the dew-kissed lawn, enjoying the warm charcoal air, the smell of new beginnings. She smiled, watching Penny and Alistair play among the hills. "Look," Alistair shouted, pointing at what might have been a grasshopper or butterfly. "The fairy's getting away." "I've got it, I've got it, I've got it!" Penny shrieked, hands wisping the air. Molly knew that Alistair was too old to chase insects, but let alone fairies. But he was making believe for his sister's benefit, and it was working. Penny leapt between hills with an almost manic glee, her cheeks flushed with color. Some might have thought it disrespectful for children to play among the dead, but Molly knew differently. She knew that among those hills lay Penny and Alistair's own grandparents. Molly could almost picture them resting underground, listening happily as the children and their children laughed and ran overhead. Constance approached Molly's side. The woman still looked thin from her sickness, but she was standing on her own. "Listen to them play," she said, her voice touched with awe. "It's like music." She looked at Molly, her eyes creased as she smiled. "We have you to thank for that." Molly shifted her feet. "I'm just the help, ma'am." Constance laughed, the first real laugh Molly had heard from her, in all their time together. She took a deep, hungry breath, surveying the world around her. Things are going to be different this time. Better. I'm glad to hear it, Molly said. I suppose you're moving back to town? The woman shook her head. We're staying here. Some people from the village have offered to let us stay with them until we can rebuild a home. Bertrand had a bit of insurance on the house. It won't be that much money, but it will be enough. She turned to Molly. We might even have room for a few more. Not as servants, you understand. As family. She took Molly's hand, and Molly was surprised by the warmth coursing through the woman's fingers. Molly felt tears spring to her eyes. Ma'am, I don't know what to say. A part of her wanted to say yes, to live forever in this new place, but she knew it wouldn't be right. The Windsors needed time to rebuild themselves, time to be a family, and some things Molly knew had to be done alone. It's kind of you, ma'am, it is. But Kip and me belong somewhere else, and it's my job to find that place. The woman smiled, and Molly could see that she understood. Look who I found, called a voice from the trees. Molly turned to see Master Windsor emerge from the woods, Galileo in tow. The horse, who had run off in the fire, was covered in brambles and burrs and specks of mud. Master Windsor caught up with them, a little out of breath, but smiling all the same. I found him in the woods by the riverbed. He was munching on these. He drew a bouquet of flowers from behind his back and offered them to his wife. They were not magic glowing night flowers, but plain spring wildflowers, and they were lovely. Constance took the bouquet, pressing it to her nose. Oh, Bertrand! She clutched them to her chest as if these flowers were more precious than all the diamonds in the world. Molly looked between them and started to feel as if she maybe shouldn't be there. And she was right. No sooner had she led Galileo away than Master Windsor pulled his wife close and kissed her, right there in broad daylight. Molly walked the horse to her brother, who was standing at the remains of the house. Steam rose from the warm embers as they crackled in the early light. It's almost beautiful, Molly said, standing behind him. Kip nodded but did not move. I keep thinking about all of it. About the tree, these graves, the Gardner. He cannot hurt us. I know. Kip shook his head. He was once a regular gardener like me. Them flowers in the woods, he planted 'em, cared for 'em. Then the tree came along and he cared for that too. What was his crime? Making a wish? Wanting something that couldn't be? Kip blinked his eyes. There's no difference in me, so why did I deserve to live? Molly put a hand on his shoulder. We'll never know, and maybe that's best. It's a bad tale that has all the answers. Kip hopped back, looking at her. I suppose there's one difference between him and me. He didn't have you protecting him. Ma and Dad done right to trust you. Molly pulled her mouth tight, not wanting to cry. Just you wait. There's time for me to kill us both yet. She messed with his hair and led him toward the wagon. She was surprised to feel his hand on her arm, using her for support as they went. The Windsors assembled on the drive to see Molly and Kip off. Master Windsor had loaded up the back of the wagon with several baskets of food, telling Molly that it was far more than his family could want. He also gave them blankets and some clothes. Molly accepted the offer with a polite nod. But why do you have to leave? Penny said as they loaded up the last of their things. Her face was pinched and pricked with red, her fists clenched, an imitation of anger. Molly knelt down. Oh, Miss Penny. She stroked the girl's hair. Her wiry black strands were softer and touched with an auburn hue that almost glowed in the sunlight. You're old enough to look after yourself now. Besides, Kip and me got our own road ahead of us. I promise, though, you've not seen the last of me. Will you? The girl took an enormous trembling breath. Will you visit often? I cannot say, Molly smiled, but when I do, I expect you'll give me a good and proper tucking in. Fair? She crossed her heart to show she was serious. Penny did the same. Fair. She wrapped her arms around Molly's neck, squeezing her with a surprising strength. There was more hugs and goodbyes and good shares of tears. Molly even saw Alistair shyly approach the wagon and offer Kip a crudely formed branch, which he had shaped into a crutch. A new courage. She was pleased to see Kip take it and shake his hand. At last, Molly and Kip climbed onto the bench of the wagon, and with a flick of the reins, Kip steered them across the bridge and up into the valley. Chapter 56, Storyteller at the Crossroads. Molly and her brother rode in silence for some time, each of them mulling over all they had seen and experienced and what they were leaving behind. When they reached the crossroads, Kip pulled the reins, stopping the wagon. "Where to?" he said. Molly squinted against the sun. The road spread out before them in 3 directions, all of them glowing with dew and steam. "I got no idea." She slid a hand into her coat pocket. A smile played on the corners of her mouth. "What is it?" Kip said. Molly pulled her hand out, showing Kip the oilskin parcel that Hester had left them. It was very light and fit easily in the palm of her hand. She said it was something special, something we might want. Kip leaned close. "You think we should open it?" "I think the time might be right." Molly carefully removed the twine and unfurled the oilskin, holding her hand underneath to catch whatever was inside. But nothing came out. "The skin's empty," she said, feeling a twinge of disappointment. "No, it ain't." Kip took the skin from her and turned it over. He spread it out on the bench between them, smoothing out the creases. The inside of the skin was marked with faded blue lines that ran together to make roads and rivers and mountains and seas. "It's a map," Molly whispered. "And look," Kip pointed to the place at the topmost corner where the land had been marked with a red dot. "What do you think? Do you think it's a buried treasure?" Molly shook her head. She ran her fingers over the skin, tracing the roads. She recalled Hester's words. She had said she wasn't the settling down type. I think it's a home." "How do you know that?" Molly shrugged. She thought of the look in the woman's eyes as she handed Molly the final offering. "I just have a feeling." Molly smiled. "A home, eh?" Kip took the map, staring at the twisting little roads. "It looks like an awfully long way," he said. "We've little food and less money." Molly peered into the trees. Somewhere in the distance she thought she could hear the faint honeybee drone of the old hurdy-gurdy. "I bet that's more than a few folks willing to swap room and board for a good story." She winked at Kip. "And I know a whopper." Kip took the reins, urging Galileo onto the middle path. The wagon rocked and rattled as it rolled over the muddy road. "I hear there's dragons in some lake up north," he said. "Maybe we can stop on the way." "Oh, that'll be a sight to behold." Molly put an arm around her brother. "If we're lucky, maybe we're flying. Maybe the flying ones will be out for summer." Molly and her brother swapped stories as their little wagon carried them out of the valley and into the warm light of the new day. That is the end. I hope you enjoyed it. It took us a very, very long time to get through, but I hope you enjoyed it.